What's up guys, my name is Jasmine, welcome back to Sonderistic. Welcome to another book talk as well. It's been a while since I've done one of these and I've read a couple books since the last book talk. So today we're going to be talking about Scythe by Neal Shusterman. Where do I even begin with this book, to be honest? I know where we begin. We begin with the 20-word summary, right? Because I still do those, which was so hard to come up with for this book, to be honest, because there's so much stuff that happens in this book. My 20-word summary is: two teens apprentice a scythe whose sole duty is to execute humans in a world where death doesn't exist. And even that just doesn't summarize everything that happens in there. Also, it's really hard for me to talk about non-spoilery stuff in this book because you have to read it, by the way. I loved this, by the way, so I'm definitely recommending this to anyone who needs to read this, no matter what age you are in. This works for everyone. Not really like a typical YA and not typically something that I gravitate towards. This was something a lot more than that. Keeping just with the non-spoilery parts, there are so many things in here in this futuristic world that's driven by science fiction that was interesting for me to read. For one thing, a lot of the characters mentioned things that are normal to us, normal terms, but are stuff that they're like, oh yeah, I remember reading that in a history book, that doesn't exist anymore now, but I kind of know what it's about, but not really. For example, it mentions a city that once had a huge silver arch that was destroyed from terrorism, and it's just ruins now there. The word murder is used to signify just a group of pros at that point instead of the heinous act that happened in the past, since this doesn't happen anymore. Death doesn't happen anymore. Sickness, poverty isn't there anymore. All these things that signify our humanity now have been eliminated, and so the population is just growing because there's no need to die anymore. They've conquered death. And that's basically what this book is about. What would society be like if you conquered death? What would be the consequences of your actions? This is a book that talks about the themes of life and death, humanity and mortality, people who fear their power and people who use their power to pose fear in others. It was really interesting to see how these characters base their decisions off this mentality that no matter what happens, I'm not gonna die. I don't know, while reading it, it just made me think about myself. What were the things that I would do in these kinds of situations as I was reading about these two characters? But I'm still in awe of what this author did and how he created it, and no wonder it has an award, because it's so good. It's so good. Okay, now we're gonna get into the spoiler parts. Everything else that I want to talk about this is definitely gonna be spoilers for the book, so you have 5 seconds to turn away from this video before I start speaking about the spoilery stuff. Let's do this. Faraday dying in the middle of this book was really hard for me to come to terms with. Let me just start with that, okay? It was just one of those moments where I just felt utterly hopeless reading this book. Here was this guy that used his power, his necessary power. He knew that he had to execute people and there was a need to keep the population down, but he did so in a humane way and in a way that showed kindness in his victims, as opposed to other people and other characters in this book. He seemed to be one of the few scythes in this book that used his power in the most unselfish and thoughtful way possible. And then he died, and that made the reader think that this was his way of releasing Citra and Rowan, I sure hope I'm saying those names right, Citra and Rowan from their ties to the Scythedom, which is the ultimate death and the most symbolistic and just really nice way to go. And then we're introduced to Scythe Curry. I hope I'm saying that right as well. I know all of these names for these scythes were figures of history that were prominent and did something symbolic that they really liked. But I don't know a Faraday and I don't know a Curie. Curry. I'm gonna keep saying Curry. Please don't kill me. So anyways, then we meet Scythe Curry, who used her powers to benefit everyone, including those of the families that she reaped. That's the word, reaped, not executed. To get to know those victims and their family members and what they were like as they were alive. And this was all a way for her to keep her humanity, basically. Reading about how Scythe Faraday and Curry went about with their reapings. Was it reapings or gleanings? Gleanings. Reading about how Scythe Faraday and Curry went about with their gleanings was like a breath of fresh air for me. They weren't posed as the villains, even though, in a sense, society could have viewed the Scythes as villains. I mean, they literally could be walking around looking like the Grim Reaper with a big old robe. I mean, for one thing, that's literally what that's what the cover looks like, is the Grim Reaper in a red robe. Which, by the way, like, this is such a beautiful cover, by the way, just saying. But reading about the processes that Scythe Curry and Faraday went through in order to choose those that they were gleaning showed the positives to these necessary deaths that they were causing for society. The bad guy in here, which I'm not entirely sure I can say was the bad guy, but the main antagonist in this story and his group of followers were really frustrating, but really interesting to read, to be honest. It was interesting in the sense of how they chose to go about with their gleanings and how they liked and favored mass gleanings, which meant they would go into some public place with a bunch of people and just wreak havoc and kill everyone in there, and that would count for their quota that they had to reach at the end of the year. And so while it was interesting to read about them, I didn't really focus too much on them because I was too busy thinking about these overarching themes that the author posed in the beginning of the book, and also how extensive of a world that this author made. Like, any questions or any loopholes that you could think of, he already thought of it, and there's no way out of these certain situations that these characters had to be in. The main characters, Citra and Rowan, because they're a boy and girl, I automatically thought that there was going to be some kind of a romance coming between the two of them, and about 3/4 through the book I realized that nothing like that was going to happen. There were rules that were put that the two of them were not able to ever be together forever, and I thought, you know, that's never stopped other YA book couples before, so. And for a second, when I realized that, I put the book down, and I didn't read it for a couple of days. And then I thought to myself how stupid that was. I didn't choose this book right off the bat because I wanted to read about some kind of a romance. I'm not typically one for those kinds of things, but I like to have something like that in my books, and when I realized it wasn't going to be like that, I felt a little disappointed, and then I had to think about what I had read already and how different it had been and how captivating the world had been and how I wasn't even focusing on the characters anymore, and I was more focusing on the entire book and the world that this is taking place in instead of just the specific characters. And that's how I knew that this book was something completely different than anything I've ever read, and I was in love. I fell in love. I fell in love with this book. Okay, here's a huge topic that's like huge for me. He actually created an artificial intelligence that I could get behind. Let's let that sink for a little bit. Okay, yes, Jasmine liking an artificial intelligence for once in her life? Yeah, I actually did. I didn't mind the idea of the Thunderhead, which was the all-knowing power that was given pretty much all power and control over everything in the world besides the Scythe Dome and those who were to be executed and whatnot. That was the one thing that it was programmed to not deal with in any way. The book ended with Citra having this conversation with the AI Thunderbird, and her finding out that the Thunderbird was not pleased with how these executions and gleanings were going on in the world, especially with the corruption that was taking place in the Scythe Dome. But unfortunately, the Thunderbird was unable to interfere in any way, but it left us feeling like he's finding a way to interfere and to change things for the better. And for once, this was an artificial intelligence that had everyone's best intentions at heart and wanted to actually help the world instead of going crazy. On Twitter, I follow a lot of authors, and I saw someone retweeted a certain interview that Neal Shusterman had where he asked the question, what if rather than this AI being this terrible, evil thing, it ended up being the greatest thing we ever created? And I think that's just like perfect. Like just a breath of fresh air, a new take on artificial intelligence to show me like, hey, maybe they're not all that bad. Because I'm tired of seeing artificial intelligence being portrayed in a terrible light and people not heeding the warnings that they are creating themselves in these books. So my final thoughts on this: the author is a genius. That's a given. I absolutely loved everything in this world and everything that took part in this world, and I loved how it was created, and I completely understand why it won an award, because it just deserves an award. This is not a typical YA book. This is a book that people of all ages can read and enjoy, and I feel as though people even older will be able to find things that they really enjoyed in this book. So on a scale of 0 to 5, I give this book 5 out of 5 stars for themes that transcend a young adult audience, believable situations and mentalities in a science fiction driven world, and number 3, bottom line, it made me question my mentality and my morality. Like, would I be strong enough to make these kind of decisions like these characters did? I don't know. So that's the end of my review today. Thank you so much for watching my video. If you made it this far to the end, I really appreciate it. And I'll see you on my next book talk. Bye!